everybody. Welcome to another episode. I'm Mike Monticello.
I'm Ryan Pizlakowski.
And I'm Alex Nizick.
So today we're going to devote most of the podcast to talking about our first impressions of the 2022 Buick Enclave, version of which we rented from Buick to gather these initial impressions. And if you don't know what the Enclave is, it's a pretty good-sized, mid-sized three-row SUV, meaning it's on the larger side among mid-sized SUVs. It's kind of a little old school in that it uses a naturally aspirated V6, meaning it doesn't have a turbocharger or anything like that, or any kind of a hybrid. Makes a really nice 310 horsepower, matched to a 9-speed automatic transmission, comes in front or all-wheel drive. And Enclave pricing starts at $42,800, but the one we rented from Buick, which is the top trim Avenir with all-wheel drive, costs $60,540, including the $1,195 destination charge. Lots of standard active safety and driver assistance features, including forward collision warning, automatic emergency braking with pedestrian detection, blind spot warning, rear cross traffic warning, lane departure warning, and lane keeping assistance. And, over the years, the Enclave has done pretty well in our testing, as a comfortable ride, quiet interior. Like I said, it's on the roomy side among these mid-sized three-row SUVs. And of course, we've always enjoyed the smooth powertrain. And this 2022 version, it's more of a refresh than a full redesign. So, Alex, why don't you take us through what are the kind of major changes that they did for 2022?
Yeah, so we rented this Enclave because a couple of things that changed could potentially have an impact on our score, right? Our overall score for the vehicle. So we don't always get a vehicle that's been refreshed and kind of reevaluate it and check out the things that have changed. But we felt that there were significant changes here that could impact the score. So 3 big ones. The main one is the infotainment system is now updated to basically match what you're going to find in other GM vehicles, including other Buicks. And it works pretty well. It's a pretty simple, well laid out system. The next one is the steering wheel controls. So I think most of the cluster is pretty much the same, but the actual controls that you use to interact with it are different. So before it kind of had these D-pads on the steering wheel, and now you have these thumb wheels that are just a little bit easier to use. And then you get those volume rockers on the back of the steering wheel. The last one, the most significant one, the one that really impacts the score, is the shifter. So before they kind of had this, it's a monostable shifter that returns to center, but it had this weird shape to it. I think it almost like a 7, where you had to push it up into the left if you wanted reverse. And I know it always, or a lot of times you ended up in neutral instead of the gear that you were intending to select. So they've got rid of that, and they put in this push-pull style push button gear selector that you find in other Buicks. And it's better, I would say. You guys can chime in for sure, but it's still not great. I think one of the problems with it is that the D and the R are both pull switches, but they look and feel super similar. So you really can't use this thing without looking directly down. It's low on the console. Yes, better than the monostable that was there before, but maybe not, a perfect solution. But yeah, the whole idea here is just updating the Enclave to be more in line with the other Buick models. Since it's kind of the oldest one in the lineup, they wanted to refresh it, make it more, comparable to the others.
Yeah, and we can get a little more into the controls and the gear selector as we get further into it. But Ryan, let's start with people who have maybe never driven an Enclave, don't know much about the Enclave. What is this thing like to drive? Talk us through the driving dynamics of it, powertrain, ride and handling, those kinds of things.
You had mentioned it's a larger midsize SUV, so it does also drive that way. It feels like a good size vehicle, right? And not in a bad way, but you definitely can feel it. I thought the steering was like a little light, a little bit light on feedback. It handles itself just fine, but it's not a handler by any means. You get a little bit of body roll, but it turns in well, and it's completely competent. But you do feel its size and its weight a little bit. That naturally aspirated V6 is kind of nice. I appreciate to see that in today's day and age. Everything's a smaller displacement turbo, which is fine too. But this is kind of old school in that manner, as you said. But I thought it shifted quite well too. I mean, it here and there, maybe on a downshift, you could feel it would. You could feel the shift a little bit, but mostly smooth. And I was quite pleased with it. Relatively easy to drive, if you will. Alex touched on the shifter. I agree. It's better, but it's marginally better than the monostable. The monostables are tricky sometimes, but the push buttons are also that way. And to your point, some of the buttons they're similar. So you got to look down. It might take a longer period of time for you to get used to that without looking, but I recommend you look, make sure you're going in the right gear there.
Right.
And ride, I thought that, a stiff kick here and there and a good, a good joint in the road or something. But in general, it follows the road nicely. It rides pretty well. It's a comfortable car. And I sometimes I forget, I forget about this car because it's not, it doesn't just stick out in my mind as like some wonderful car, but it's also not a bad car at all. Like, for people that have asked me, to recommend what cars they might want to look into. And I kind of forget about this. And this is a car that I would suggest to some people, depending on the situation. So all in all, I thought it was, I was quite pleased with it.
Yeah, it really doesn't do anything badly, and that may seem like faint praise, but I mean, in this day and age, that actually, with whether it's controls or a really stiff ride or whatever it may be, and the stiff ride often these days comes from just gigantic wheels that the automakers decide to put on more for a look standpoint. But Alex, any thoughts? Expand upon what Ryan was talking about as far as the driving dynamics.
Yeah, I think he nailed it. He touched on everything. I don't think the Enclave is anything that's really going to necessarily excite anybody, but that's okay. It's not really trying to. It's just a nice, competent, quiet, comfortable vehicle to drive around in. And, he kept saying old school a couple times, and it does give that feel as far as just the interior and the layout. Everything's pretty simple, straightforward, maybe minus the shifter a little bit, but everything else is pretty straightforward. And that carries through, I think, with the carries through with the driving experience. All the inputs were pretty natural to me. Steering's a little light, but it responded the way you would expect. The brakes responded as you would expect. Yeah, and overall, it's pretty nice, and it rides well. It's one of those cars in terms of the ride, like you can feel or hear rather the suspension working as you go over some of these bigger bumps. You hear that tire slap, and you can kind of tell that it's working hard. But ultimately, what you feel in the car is pretty minimal, and it does a good job of soaking up those bumps. So, again, doesn't really excite necessarily, but I agree with Ryan. It's a great option that maybe goes under the radar in some ways, but definitely holds up.
No, I was just going to say, don't take old school, the phrase old school, as a bad thing, okay? Because that's not always a bad thing. No,
right? And I think one of the reasons why it's not a bad thing is because whether, with these, you mentioned it, Ryan, turbocharged, small displacement, turbocharged engines, what we find with those, or maybe some dual clutch transmissions, again, this has just a regular, naturally aspirated engine and just a regular 9-speed automatic, no dual clutch or CVT or anything like that. What we're finding is it gets off the line without any hesitation. So there's no turbo lag, there's no transmission confusion, and it's got some real power, and it likes to rev too. Sometimes these turbocharged powertrains back in the old days, I mean, we're talking a long time ago, turbos didn't used to have anything down low. Now they've totally redesigned them, and they have lots of low end power. This thing has good low end power, but it also, it loves revving too. So actually, we talked about, this is a good everyday vehicle, but I think one of the reasons why is because it's got so much interior space. And I mean, there's plenty of room up front for the driver, but I think when you look at, a 3-row SUV, one of the things you got to think about is, okay, how usable is that third row? And I don't know if either one of you guys sat back there, but it's actually not bad as far as, like, people say, oh, well, the third row is just for kids. And maybe for the most part it is. But like, again, I'm not a huge guy, but I could fit back there for at least a certain amount of time. I had some headroom to spare. There was good foot room underneath the seats in front of me. The only place where it really is let down is what they have to do with these third rows to get them to have any headroom is they have to put the seat really low to the ground. And so that means it's a little uncomfortable. You got that uncomfortable knee bend. Your knees are up in the air and you don't have any leg support. But the second row also, this one had captain's chairs, which means 2 individual seats. I thought it had pretty good space and was pretty comfy too. Did you guys find that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I thought the second row was quite comfortable, and I like a captain's chair setup. It's not practical for everyone, maybe, but I think having that setup though allows a third row to feel even a little bigger because you have some room in the center. There's a gap between the two of the second row seats.
Like to spread one of your legs out, right?
Yeah.
You don't feel so walled in.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm a decent sized guy. So like the third row is pretty snug, but yeah, I mean, I could sit back there if I had to, especially because I could straighten a leg out in that little alley there in the middle if I needed to. But yeah, it's a decent sized interior. I was kind of impressed with it.
It kind of bridges the gap a little bit between something like, I don't know, a Sorrento 3-row, which is a smaller mid-size 3-row, and then to something like a Tahoe or even a Suburban or something like that, right? Where it's that full-size 3-row. This is kind of in the between a little bit.
And the other benefits of that is, we talked about it's a pretty nice driving vehicle. Yeah, it's not a handler, but then neither is a Tahoe or a Suburban or anything like that.
No, absolutely.
But it drives more like a, car. This is why we would call it a crossover. It drives more, on the end of more normal feeling car type vehicle than, a body on frame pickup truck based vehicle like those. Right. So that's one of its big benefits, is that it doesn't feel like this kind of, even though it has some old school aspects like the drivetrain, the way it's set up, it's not really, in terms of its ride and handling, is really more like a regular SUV.
Well, I was going to ask, do you guys think, since this is a refresh, updated, does it hold up in 2022 compared to maybe some of the other 3-rows that we've driven recently? I don't know what comes to mind. Pathfinder, Sorrento, I suppose. Some of these other 3-rows. Grand Cherokee L is brand new. I'm curious what you guys think about that. I think in general, yes, is my answer. But
so I'll say that too. I mean, I think of, you mentioned the Pathfinder. I think kind of on par with that.
They're all kind of simple with these most of them with the naturally aspirated V6, right? They all kind of follow this similar format. It's just, it doesn't maybe have some of the tech, like the screen's not large and in your face and with all these beautiful graphics, but which you might get elsewhere. But otherwise, I thought it did a pretty good job.
I think it was a worthy refresh to do that to that vehicle, because it is a good. I think it's a good platform to work with for sure. Yeah, there are better choices out there, but I don't think this is no slouch.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think they did they were starting from a pretty good, platform in a sense, with a nicely tuned powertrain and a comfortable ride, which again, we don't always see these days.
Right.
I think that, when you look at the fit and finish of the Avenir, again, this is the top trim. So really, this is considered more of a, Buick in general is a luxury brand. But the Avenir trim for sure makes it considered a luxury SUV. And I think there's a few areas. Yes, there's lots of padded areas and that kind of stuff. And there was this kind of nice scalloped wood trim that looked pretty neat. But then there's some things that, don't quite, hold up for a $60,000 vehicle, like just the way the center console lid, flops open, and the sunroof shade just acts and sounds really pretty tacky, and just the way the dashboard air vents move seem very plasticky, and so those kinds of things are a little bit of a letdown. And as far as the controls, of course, these days we go on about controls, and some people think maybe we go on too much, but that's our job. The reality is simpler controls are better for when you're driving, right? And I like that the climate control, and these days we're just like hip hip hooray if they actually have physical controls rather than some kind of capacitive touch, right? Where it's not a physical button or physical knob. And this thing has, like, for the climate controls are separate. They're physical knobs and buttons. I like that. I thought they were kind of a little bit low, so not really easy to access. And then I totally agree with you, Alex, on the gear selector. Like, it's confusing when you do like push and pull. I think that, some buttons you push and some buttons you pull. I believe some of these monostable gear selectors you can get comfortable with pretty easily. I think this one would take a while, and you'd have to look down maybe every time, whereas even some monostables, we're used to PRNDLs where for sure you don't even have to look down when you're, park is all the way up and drive is all the way down. And then some monostables, okay, you realize that reverse is up and drive is back, and then you're kind of good, right? But this one, because the buttons just all kind of are different from each other, you really have to look down like, okay, so which am I pressing? Oh, nope, it's a pull, not a I don't know. It's just kind of, it's like, it's better, but it's still kind of not that great.
Not great. Right. Yeah, we've had a couple GM vehicles with this shifter now, and it doesn't seem to matter which one it is. After a couple days in it, I find myself I'll be backing out of my driveway, for example, and I'll pull R instead of D. seem to always do that. And really the only thing differentiating them without looking at it is two tiny little dots on the underside so that you can maybe feel them. I don't know that most people would. So that's, in contrast to something like the Acura shifter, which is also using pull and push, but they're way different than, each button to the next is either a different shape, a different size, or whatever. So you can at least feel it a little bit better. This is, like you said, a little too similar button to button.
All right. Well, to sum up, great powertrain, comfortable ride, slightly improved controls, and including the gear selector, but again, it's still not great. We've got more information on the 2022 Buick Enclave on consumerreports.org, so please go check that out. And let's move on to this week's audience questions. Don't forget to send those questions, comments, 30-second video clips to talkingcars@icloud.com. We love those video clips, folks, so be sure to send those along. This week's audience question is Terry from Seattle, and Terry says, can I tell you how wonderful you all are? Not only am I learning a lot about cars, but whenever I have a car conundrum, I know who to contact. While driving my 2016 Ford Fusion Hybrid, I accidentally pressed the ignition button while reaching for my console. Fortunately, the power steering and power brakes continued to work, so I was able to safely coast to the shoulder. I tried pressing the ignition again while rolling to a stop, but the interlock system wouldn't let me start the car again until I was in park. I understand the purpose of the interlock system, but why would Ford allow me to turn off the engine while my car is in motion? Do you know of any reason why one would need to turn a car off while in motion? Why doesn't Ford prevent this, or at least flash a warning on the console? Curious minds want to know. So, first of all, thank you, Terry, for the kind words. We always appreciate that. Honestly, I think, answering car questions, helping people out with whether it's buying new cars or that's what we do. That's what we love doing. That's our whole reason for existence. So we appreciate that you appreciate it. The question you ask is really interesting because I think a lot of people probably don't know it. And not just because most of us aren't going to try and turn off the car at 70 miles an hour on the highway, which Terry did this accidentally. But, most people aren't even going to, I wonder if that's a thing, and try it. So they're not going to do that. But it's a really interesting question. Ryan, you did a little research of your own in the safe environment of the Auto Test Center's test track to kind of see what was going on and what exactly happens when you just press the button to turn the car off.
Yeah, so I didn't know the answer to this, and I was curious, very curious. So, of course, we don't have any cars that old. Not that that's that old, but all the cars we have are, 2021 at least and up, or 2020 and up. So we don't have a 2016 Ford Hybrid anywhere on the property, but we do have two Ford Mavericks. So yeah, and the Hybrid has a push button start, and the non-hybrid actually has a physical key, which kind of rare these days in some cars, or in a lot of cars actually. So I took them down. I did the regular gas car first down the straightaway, and I just turned the key off, and it turned off. But the steering was working and the brakes were working.
Yeah.
So I kind of pretended to pull over, like I could pull over. While doing that, I did try to restart it, and it wouldn't start. I found the same thing that she found.
Yep.
So and then I had to put it in park, and then it would let me start it, and off I went. Hybrid, same thing. But the Hybrid, I found the button. I had to hold the button, not very long, but longer than you couldn't just touch it. It was like at least a second hold, maybe a little longer, but it was more of a hold. And then it turned off, and it allowed me to steer, and the brakes worked, and I pulled over to the side. It wouldn't turn back on until I did that, put it in park, and then I restarted it. I didn't know that was the scenario there. That it allows you to turn them off. So what you found is we myth busted it, and it is it's possible.
Did it seem, Ryan, like each car stayed in an accessory mode when you shut it off?
Yeah.
Like it was still, gauges were lit up, everything. It's not like completely shut off.
Sure, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it was all
which
lit
enables
up,
that brakes and steering.
So, yeah, but it was in like an accessory mode, and it tells you right in the dash that you can't turn it back on until you pull over and park it, and then then we can restart it. So, it was quite interesting.
Yeah. So the reality is,
yeah.
On the one hand, it might seem crazy that you can actually turn your car off, on the highway while it's in motion, right? That seems unsafe. But the reality is, it's actually done for a safe reason. In other words, let's say if your car was having some kind of a crisis, whether it's something caught on fire or whatever, or maybe think of the Toyota unintended acceleration debacle from the mid 2000s, right? You need to get your car to turn off quickly. Well, if you physically turn the key like you did in the regular Ford Maverick, right, it knows you really want to turn that car off, so it turns off. On a push button start car, it's not like, and hopefully what happened with Terry is that the button was pushed a little longer than just a press, because they're not supposed to turn off in just one press of the button. You have to hold them, as you found, Ryan, for a couple seconds to kind of say, no, I really want to turn this car off. But that's done so that if your car was having some kind of a crisis, it would actually turn off. So it may seem unsafe, but it's actually done for safety reasons.
It was we learned something.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Terry, for the question. And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to learn more about the cars and the topics we talked about, you can click on the links in the show notes. Don't forget to send those questions, comments, 30-second video clips to talkingcars@icloud.com. This episode was produced by Dave Abrams and edited by Anatoly Shumsky. Apparently, we don't have the funds to put those graphics at the end of the video like on every other YouTube video that's out there. But that's the way we do it. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see y'all next week.